Welcome, everyone. I am Margot Crawford, a professor of English here at the University of Pennsylvania, and I am also the director of the Center for Africana Studies. This conversation is a part of the Center's Emergent Research Colloquium. This colloquium puts the spotlight on the most vibrant emergent zones of Black studies. And our speakers today are Shaun, Ossei-Owusu, and Elizabeth Hinton. And let me begin by introducing Shaun. He is the Presidential Assistant Professor of Law here at the University of Pennsylvania Carey Law School. He is an interdisciplinary legal scholar with expertise in legal history, criminal law and procedure, civil rights, and the legal profession. Shaun's work sits at the intersection of law, history, and sociology. He also works on stratification in legal education and the legal profession. His work has been published or is forthcoming in the New York University Law Review, University of Pennsylvania Law Review, the Virginia Law Review, Michigan Law Review, UCLA Law Review, Southern California Law Review, Wisconsin Law Review, and the American Journal of Law and Medicine. His book, The People's Champ, Legal Aid from Slavery to Mass Incarceration, is under contract with Harvard University Press. Elizabeth Hinton is Associate Professor in the Department of History and the Department of African American Studies at Yale, with a secondary appointment as Professor of Law. Hinton's research focuses on the persistence of poverty, racial inequality, and urban violence in the 20th century United States. She is considered one of the nation's leading experts on criminalization and policing. Hinton is the author of From the War on Poverty to the War on Crime, The Making of Mass Incarceration in America, published by Harvard University Press. She is also the co-editor of The New Black History, Revisiting the Second Reconstruction with Manny Marable. Please don't hesitate to type questions as you listen. Without any more delay, let the conversation begin.
Great, so I'm going to share my screen and let's cross our fingers that there will be no problems on this regard. Okay. Can everyone see that? Can you see it, Elizabeth? You're the one person okay, great. One other thing. I have a lot of screens going on, so forgive me if it does not look like I'm looking at the camera. Great, okay. So good afternoon, everyone. I want to start off by thanking Margot for the introduction, as well as Gail and the Center for helping organize this event. And I want to thank Elizabeth for taking time out to engage my work. And I'd like to thank you all in the audience for coming out to hear about it. I'm sure many people here have Zoom fatigue, so I'm appreciative of everyone coming out. So today I'm going to give you a fast and furious run through my book project, The People's Champ, Legal Aid from Slavery to Mass Incarceration. It's under contract with Harvard University Press, and it's been generously supported by a variety of organizations, most notably New America. So the deceptively simple argument that animates the book is this: race and racial justice have been central to the development of American legal aid organizations. So what do I mean by legal aid? By legal aid, I'm referring specifically to the organized provision of legal services and information to people who can't afford it. Now, I say deceptively simple because this is an argument that is in fact tricky to pull off because of how formal law understands legal assistance, as well as our kind of common sense historical and contemporary assumptions about legal aid. So the standard story is this: legal aid, whether on the criminal side and actualized through public defenders, or on the civil side with lawyers who help people with public benefits or housing, is primarily about an inability to afford an attorney. It's about poverty. And that's right. And even the stipulated definition that I have here points to that. But part of what my book project argues is that race has been an important organizing principle for the delivery of legal services. When the history of American legal aid is seen as being about race and not just about class, this perspective provides new ways of thinking about benevolence, the persistence of racial discrimination, and how efforts to address racial inequality have fallen short. So at this point, I'm going to take you through a quick voyage and describe 200 years of history of legal aid in about 20 minutes that will hopefully pique your interest and remain in the recesses of your memory and reappear when the book hopefully comes out in 2022 and you see it on your algorithmically determined social media feeds, or when you see me talking about it with my post-COVID-19 haircut. And I see a couple of former students from last year, so you know what my hair looked like back then. So an important clarifying point for some of the people here who may not be familiar with the niceties of legal aid. And so the right to counsel, as is currently understood and found in the Sixth Amendment, doesn't get fully fleshed out until the middle 20th century. Until then, it was interpreted, like many parts of the Constitution, in what legal scholars call negative liberties, or the kinds of things that government can't do or restrict people from doing. So the First Amendment says the government can't prevent the exercise of religion or free speech. The Fourth Amendment says the government can't engage in unreasonable searches and seizures. And so the Sixth Amendment right to counsel was understood as the government can't prevent you from bringing an attorney in a criminal case, but not that it has an affirmative obligation to provide you with an attorney. So up until the 20th century, poor people who can't afford lawyers are getting services through pro bono lawyers, legal aid clinics at law schools. You know, some states make their own decisions to provide lawyers in a specific category of cases. These are typically serious felonies. And for our purposes, legal aid societies. So in typical histories of legal aid, the starting point is the New York Legal Aid Society, which began in 1876 as the German Legal Aid Society out of a concern for German immigrants who were getting taken advantage of by their landlords and by their employers. So on the left is the copy of their annual report from 1891. The organization widened its services and evolved into the New York Legal Aid Society, which exists today. And on the right is a picture of the organization's branch on the east side in the late 1890s. Most recently, legal historian Felice Batlin has forced scholars to look a decade earlier to the development of working women's protective unions, which developed in the 1860s and were staffed primarily by lay women lawyers. These women provided legal services in ways that were erased by subsequent histories. My project builds on these histories and suggests that we could look even earlier to abolitionist societies that provided legal aid to fugitive slaves and the white abolitionists that helped them. And so the early parts of the book focus on abolitionist societies in Boston, New York City, and Philadelphia. And I'll briefly describe one. So the one that I want to focus on is the Pennsylvania Abolitionist Society, which was created by a majority group of Quakers in 1775 in response to the freedoms case of a woman named Dina Neville. So from the historical record, it's unclear whether Neville was Indian or Black, but what was clear was that she wasn't free. She moved from New Jersey to Pennsylvania and declared herself and her children free. Her case ends up going to the court, and the Pennsylvania Abolitionist Society funded her defense. She ends up losing, but the decision leads them to pursue more organized legal action in ways that would serve as a model for subsequent abolitionist organizations. So Pennsylvania is crucial because it's the first state to pass substantive, extensive abolitionist law in 1780. So to give you more of a geographical sense, New York doesn't pass a similar law until 19 years later in 1799, and New Jersey doesn't do so until 1804. Black abolitionist James Forten described Pennsylvania as, quote, the only state in the Union wherein the Black man is treated equally to the white. What this meant is that Pennsylvania was a popular place for Blacks escaping slavery in the South, as well as for kidnappers. And so it was a site for many legal disputes. Many of the organization's records are found in the Pennsylvania Historical Society, and the actual documents there give you a good sense of their legal services. And the breadth of their work is stunning. For plaintiffs, abolitionist lawyers aided Black family members and friends who were attempting to liberate loved ones who were kidnapped. On the defense side, abolitionist lawyers for the Pennsylvania Abolition Society would negotiate, and in some instances, outright buy the freedom of Blacks or bargain it down to indentured servitude. The society's members would also travel to other states to deliver kidnapped persons' freedom papers, and they kept many documents, some of which include manumission certificates, birth certificates, and marriage certificates of free Blacks. Other documents that you find in the archives include certificates of freedom, certificates allowing Blacks to seek employment, passports for Blacks to travel, and journalism and court documents involving cases where slaves were awarded freedom. And they kept all of this with the purpose of preventing fugitives from being re-enslaved and to help free Blacks prove their freedom in instances where kidnappers would insist that a free Black person was the human property of another. So my larger point here is that this is an early, noteworthy episode in American history that involved legal organizing that is not just about poverty, which is an associated feature of bondage, but was also about slavery, race, and racial justice. On the other side of the Civil War, we see the development of legal aid organizations as described in the historiography. So working women's protective unions developed to provide legal services to women who were being cheated in the workforce. But there were also racial undertones. And so in places like New York, their focus was primarily on the garment industry to the neglect of domestic work, which was an area populated by Black women and Irish women, who at the time occupied this kind of interstitial status as not fully white. And so this in some ways communicated racial and gendered ideas about who was considered deserving of legal services. And these were messages that, of course, we see throughout the 20th century in the welfare context. So once legal aid societies begin to develop in places like Boston in 1900, here in Philly in 1902, Cleveland in 1905, Detroit in 1909, and many other cities, you see a similar kind of privileging of certain ethnic whites for the delivery of legal services. And this is often to the neglect of racial minorities. But there's some reason for this focus. The years surrounding the turn of the 20th century are often referred to as the decade of regicide. And so leaders across the world are getting assassinated by Southern and Eastern Europeans. The LA Times buildings bombed, Wall Street's bombed, and most notably, President McKinley is assassinated by a Polish-American anarchist in 1901. And so legal aid leaders fear anarchy and socialism, and they think ethnic white immigrants are led to these political views because of a certain kind of disenchantment with the legal system. So consider this quote from Reginald Heber Smith, who was the leader of the legal aid movement in the early 20th century. He says, quote, "The man who is unable through the courts to enforce his rights or secure redress when he is wrong feels a keen sense of injustice," it is pointed out. He is apt to believe, and this is particularly true of the immigrant, that American justice consists only of laws that punish and not of laws that help. The next step for him is to be against the law because he thinks the law is against them. He is then ready to listen to the forces of sedition and anarchy. So, like many progressive era reformers, legal aid leaders believe that legal aid institutionalization could be this kind of Americanizing device for these immigrants. They don't necessarily exclude Blacks, Mexican Americans, and Asian Americans, but they end up being inattentive to their legal needs. This has two important consequences for the theme of my book. First, this focus on Americanizing European immigrants was deeply racial, and it animated the development of these legal aid institutions. That's what they were kind of oriented toward. Second, what this meant was that racial minorities had to develop their own legal aid institutions. So all across the country, African Americans, Mexican Americans, and Asian Americans, and Chinese Americans in particular, developed mutual aid organizations and mutualistas in the Mexican American community to help provide legal services for their members. They also developed creative ways to provide legal services and information. So I'll quickly describe two through the lens of two people. So this is a picture of the ever so dapper Manuel Gonzalez, who is an important figure in Mexican American history. So he was the first Mexican American to graduate from the University of Texas Law School in 1924. He helped develop La Liga Protectora Mexicana, or the Mexican Protective League, which was based in Austin and helped provide legal assistance. They helped produce the compendium, a popular compendium, which sought to give the Mexican American community a snapshot of their basic legal rights in areas like housing, employment, and consumer protection. Now we have Anna Jones Robinson. Robinson was one of the first Black women to graduate from NYU Law in 1922. She was part of a group of Black lawyers who used Black newspapers to provide legal information to Black readerships. So she authored an advice column in the New York Amsterdam News, which was one of the most popular Black newspapers at the time. And the column was called Legal Talks. And so in some instances, the reader would present a legal problem and Jones would respond. And so they say, dear Mrs. Jones, I'm having this particular housing issue. And then she would write a response and it would be published in the newspaper. In other instances, she would preemptively address a legal problem that the Black community was facing, whether it be mass evictions or common consumer protection issues. And these kinds of columns existed in the Black community across the country. And they offer insights into the creative ways that minorities provided legal assistance in the early 20th century. Beginning in the 1930s, the Supreme Court would finally weigh in on the Sixth Amendment right to counsel in one of the Scottsboro Boys cases, Powell versus Alabama. So as a refresher, or for people who aren't familiar with the case, this is a famous 1931 decision involving 9 Black boys accused of raping 2 white girls in Depression-era Alabama. They're rushed through kangaroo courts and sentenced to death. The Supreme Court overturns their convictions and for the first time requires governments to provide lawyers to people who can't afford them and are facing the death penalty. So I can't overstate how crucial this moment is. This is a landmark decision requiring legal assistance, and it's an international racial scandal. And here is some of the journalism and imagery that captures the racial controversy of this case. I'll give you a couple. seconds to take a look. Yikes. So after the Powell decision, it's unclear in courts how far the right to counsel applies. So the Supreme Court would say that it's only required in death penalty cases, and then say in certain felony cases, but there's uncertainty about whether it applies more robustly for 30 years. In the meantime, throughout the 1940s and the 1950s, the court is overturning cases left and right involving Southern Black defendants who aren't provided with lawyers in these sham trials. And many of these cases are brought by the NAACP. By the 1960s, the court has had enough, and we get the case of Clarence Gideon. So this is another landmark case in American history, and it involved a 51-year-old white man accused of theft. He's charged, asks for a lawyer in court, doesn't get one, and is convicted. He handwrites a petition to the Supreme Court that is miraculously granted, has his conviction reversed, and the Supreme Court requires a more expansive right to counsel in Gideon versus Wainwright. So this decision helped spur the creation of more public defender offices around the country. And it's celebrated as a kind of David versus Goliath story where a poor white man is wrongly charged and ultimately has his rights vindicated at the Supreme Court. And so we see a New York Times bestseller come out of this story, as well as a made-for-television movie starring Henry Fonda, who was the Tom Hanks of his period. And so this is in 1963. But from the middle of the 1960s and thereafter, Black and brown people become more prominent faces of legal aid, and the tide starts to shift. So consider the case of Danny Escobedo, decided a year after Gideon in 1964. So Escobedo was a 22-year-old of, quote, Mexican extraction, to use the court's language, who was arrested in Chicago for allegedly murdering his sister's boyfriend. So he's held in custody, asked to see his lawyer who's in the building, but is refused. He confesses, is convicted of murder, and then he appeals and he wins. And so in that case, the court says, not only is there a right to counsel, but suspects have a right to counsel when they're being interrogated by the police. So this decision is the prelude to the famous Miranda case and the Miranda rights that are popularized on television. The public reaction here was swift. No more made-for-television films, but a cover on Time magazine and other mainstream outlets voicing frustration for what looks like lawyers for guilty minorities. At this point, we get the familiar story about conservative retrenchment. The court begins to scale back the right to counsel beginning in the 1970s, only a few years after it's become constitutionalized. On the criminal side, this is all happening as Elizabeth has explained in her own work, this is happening while the federal government is pumping money to localities to shore up policing. So more money for police, less legal aid protections for the defendants that are likely to be subject to unconstitutional policing. On the civil side, LBJ's War on Poverty created funding for legal aid, civil legal aid, which, along with the work of a multiracial group of women organizing, helped expand the rights of welfare recipients. But we see a similar kind of backlash here too. And so in the same ways that we see complaints about undue funding for criminal defense for minorities who are probably guilty, we see critics say, on the civil side, why are we providing money to people who are on welfare, who are on food stamps, so they can get lawyers and likely take advantage of public benefits. Alas, comes the backlash of the 1970s and the 1980s that would in part contribute to the underfunding of legal aid more generally. And my point here is that legal aid policy, funding, and support became less popular once it became attributed to Black and Brown people in the 1960s and thereafter. Now, I want to jump to the contemporary moment and why I think this is important. First, I think legal aid attorneys are crucial to what French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu calls the left and right hands of the state, the former referring to the welfare state and the latter referring to the penal state. So on the welfare side, legal aid attorneys help people get access to crucial public benefits like TANF, food stamps, Section 8, and unemployment insurance, which has become particularly relevant in this moment, as has Medicaid. On the criminal side, they are the primary bureaucrats responsible for protecting the rights of people accused of crimes, who are facing a squadron of police officers and prosecutors who are structural adversaries, as well as judges and juries who can sometimes be rife with pro-police bias or racial biases. Yet in every election season, including the one that just happened, little is said about legal aid attorneys and public defenders or funding or policy. And so the larger purpose of the project is to help elevate the importance of these attorneys. But to return to my argument, what I want to also suggest is that there are understated and under-theorized features of legal aid that need to be brought to light. An immigration court where there is no formal right to counsel, which is a problem in the context of a criminal justice system that has been intertwined with ideas about citizenship. This criminal justice system is predisposed to treat non-citizens as subhumans and not provide them with the kinds of legal aid attorneys and assistants that they would receive in the criminal context. In the housing context, Matthew Desmond in his own work has suggested that eviction is to women of color what incarceration is to men. There's no right to counsel in housing court, but a few cities are starting to change that. I see legal aid attorneys as a sort of essential legal workers. During a pandemic that's disproportionately killing people of color, I see them as helping secure the rights and benefits for racial minorities, as well as poor whites across the country. And from chatting with some of them, some see this work as essentially being racial justice work, and some do not. But what I want to call attention to is the histories, trajectories, and contemporary operations of race in this line of work. So I will end there, and I'm excited to hear what Elizabeth and you all have to say.
Oh, wow. I love that, that final slide. Thank you so much, Shaun, for that really fantastic presentation. I've had the great pleasure of being able to read Shaun's book proposal. So for me, it really illuminated a lot of the things that came through in the proposal, which is really exciting. I mean, it's clear that this is going to be a groundbreaking book, in part because of your central claim which is that race becomes important for those in terms of understanding who can access and who's denied legal services, precisely because of the way that anti-Black exploitation and discrimination has functioned in the law historically. And this, the kind of hidden role of the ways in which legal aid and public defenders have been such a crucial part of the struggle for racial justice. And I learned a lot from your proposal that I didn't know before. So you're really uncovering this history of abolition. Like, I hadn't even thought of the idea of legal aid societies as being part of this longer trajectory, which is totally spot on. And it works precisely because you're centering race instead of poverty. So it's literally helping us to see this hidden history. And especially when you're talking about the Freedmen's Bureau, I didn't even know that the Freedmen's Bureau, and this is bad. He's not on here, but my graduate advisor, Eric Boner, is like the great historian of Reconstruction, and I didn't even know the extent of the Freedmen's Bureau's activities. So it's really, really, it's a sweeping history that's like connecting the dots in such an important way to really tell to tell us something new about the history of American racism and law, and like what the struggle for racial justice has looked like, in which lawyers have always been at the center. One of the things that I think is also really key about your analysis of the Freedmen's Bureau and also the progressive era is that, for a historian of the kind of history of the relationship between Blackness and criminality, that moment is so important. And I think in showing the ways in which these progressive reformers are kind of furthering the project of pathologizing poor European ethnic groups and relatively newly freed people, and urban Blacks, this dynamic that Du Bois talks about, that Khalil Muhammad has highlighted, that basically like ascribes a certain set of or seeks to understand white crime as something that is related to socioeconomic conditions in the environment, where and then sees Black crime as something that's that is completely pathological and related to behavior. And I think that that you're showing again, and you're giving us a new kind of layer into on the way in which pathology drives well-intentioned liberal reform. I have like so many notes, and as you were speaking, I added more to them. I think so. One of the questions, I have a bunch of questions, but like one thing that I hope, and I think it came through a little bit more in the talk, but one thing that I hope that you are able to kind of keep through in the analysis is the ways in which the kind of lawyering. So the way that you presented it to a certain extent is that like beginning in with the launch of the war on crime, this kind of makes this changes the focus of public defenders and legal aid to be exclusively about challenging the punitive system. And in chapter 6, when you're talking about the Supreme Court, that's when it seems like, at least in the proposal, where you're going to talk about, so you say, quote, "The court was visibly addressing segregation, racially restricted covenants, voting rights, because of the actions of legal aid activists. It was quietly addressing racial discrimination in the criminal justice system by demanding that poor minority defendants be provided with lawyers." So there's all this, it's kind of addressing the ways in which racism operates legally. And I think, there's so many important stories of how that continues in the post-civil rights period too. That, and I know, you bring it back into the late 20th century, but I think that kind of lawyering in many ways is what helped get vulnerable communities post-civil rights new degrees of resources. And I'm thinking about this partly because I'm writing about this community in Southern Illinois called Cairo, which was basically like, under complete white supremacist terroristic domination, and launched a number of boycotts, but also like it was literally a city that was at war with itself. And there were shootings, lots of violence in this city. And part of what, because the Black community had to arm themselves to defend themselves from these white vigilantes. And part of, one of the things that really in some ways kept the community safe, in addition to the guns, was the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law. And it was a group of white lawyers who came, and basically, I mean, they were launching exactly the kind of campaigns that you're describing in the earlier period, where they're helping people get out of jail when they're getting like pulled over and arrested for arbitrary reasons, but they're also continually challenging the city's law. So I just feel like this is a really important dynamic of lawyering that seems like, you have these kind of bookends of it, but it's also happening at the same time that mass incarceration is taking off. Okay, I know that we're kind of running out of time, so I'll be quick. Thinking about, and I guess this is related too, I think that's why these public defenders and these civil rights lawyers are so important, because they're ending up, like legal aid societies, they are fulfilling this place where the state has failed. And I think that's, part of the why, the story in Carol that I was talking about. The state had failed to guarantee certain resources and protections to Black people. And so the only way to try to get them was through legal channels. And kind of that failure of the state, and the failure of the state too, that Lyndon Johnson was ostensibly trying to address in the War on Poverty, is what led for the need for public defenders in the first place. And then lastly, so I guess one of my questions in your summary of chapter 7 in your in the proposal, you didn't quite, I don't know if you got to this in your presentation, but you said, and this is totally right and very provocative, that quote, the public and courts already see Black and Latino men as publicly guilty. And so this made me think too, I really wonder what you think about kind of like the relationship between the rise of these punitive policies, mass incarceration, public defenders, and guilty pleas, and like kind of the ways in which guilt, that assumption that that men of color, people of color, are guilty, and that guilty pleas are really what pleading out is what make mass incarceration possible, because all these cases can't go to trial. So I'm also just wondering about how plea bargaining, especially in the late 20th century, fits into the story. And I hadn't even thought about this before, but it also, I think, gets to a question that immediately came to mind in the way that you ended the talk, when you asked what the difference is. You see that some public defenders see themselves as fighting for racial justice, and others don't. So I'd love to hear you talk about what makes the difference, and I wonder if, and I'm just speculating, so again, these are just totally open-ended questions because your work is so generative, but how plea bargaining and fits into that, right? Because if you're just pleading everybody out, I don't know, is that continuing the challenge, or is that continuing to challenge the forces of criminalization and mass incarceration? I have a lot more to say. I'm so excited for this book, and it's really fantastic work. So congratulations.
Thank you. That means a lot coming from you. I'll try to offer some responses to some of the things that you raised and asked questions about. For the more general audience, one of Elizabeth's comments were about the Freedmen's Bureau, which I didn't mention in the talk. I said kind of jumped through the Civil War. But part of what I describe in an earlier chapter of the book is the legal efforts of the Freedmen's Bureau. And so most people understand the Freedmen's Bureau for its creation of hospitals and its creation of historically Black colleges like Howard and Hampton universities. But they also had a legal division. And so in many instances, this federal agency that's tasked with helping Blacks transition into citizenship and freedom are representing Black parties in courts, or in some instances, paying for legal services in some of their cases. And so part of what I'm trying to describe in that chapter, or that part of the book, is how this is a very early moment. It makes sense that abolitionists might be missed in the context of legal aid histories, because abolitionist organizations occupy this unique space in terms of nonprofit civic type organizations. But the Freedmen's Bureau is a federal agency. This is a moment where the state government is funding legal assistance. And in an instance, in an episode, one of the most racialized episodes in American history. So that's to kind of help some of the audience members be insiders to what Elizabeth is referring to.
Can I just jump in there real quick? Because I forgot one of the big things I wanted to say about that period that you further illuminated, which is that like the campaign against. So one of the things you talk about is the ways in which a lot of the attorneys that were working as part of the Freedmen's Bureau were really concerned about apprenticeship programs and convict leasing and Black orphans, and actually, and then this goes to the pathologizing thing, like intervened in Black families to remove young people who they thought were not being cared for properly. And you know, I'm sure that you've thought of this, but to me, this seems to be a really crucial moment in the kind of like the foster care, like interventionist to criminalization pipeline. So again, it's just like another key moment, and the ways in which, you know, these well-meaning lawyers end up like reinforcing the logics that they're ostensibly trying to work against. So I thought that your nuance and your criticism, you know, while celebrating a lot of the important work that they were doing, but also being critical of some of their own assumptions and the ways in which their work might have exacerbated problems that were specific to Black families in the immediate years after emancipation. So sorry, I just wanted to get into.
No, so I think that's actually absolutely right, and part of what you're describing in your comment just right now, and in your question about plea bargaining, is the ugly side of legal aid, and they kind of need to like the tricky areas of complicity in terms of racial domination. And so I actually see a through line. And so in the context of the Freedmen's Bureau, for example, what these agents were doing, they would be essentially what happened was after the war, Southern individuals would kidnap Black children and say that they are apprentices. And they would pretty much slap the apprentice label on what was human bondage. So the Freedmen's Bureau agents would investigate this. And in some instances, they would reunite the children with their parents. But in other instances, they would essentially say that this is a better, particularly in instances where freed men and freed women were unemployed, they would use a kind of family law type standard around best interests of the child, and essentially say that this apprenticeship scheme would be better family scenario than being with their parents. So that's what you kind of see in the Reconstruction era. In the progressive era, when people are arguing that we need public defender offices, there are libertarians who are arguing that this idea is absurd. They're like, why do we need another bureaucrat in the criminal justice system? This is better. It'd be better if we just had private attorneys as opposed to public defenders who work with the state and are likely to conspire to get people to make plea deals. So in many ways, they're somewhat alarmist, but they're also somewhat prescient, and that they're concerned about what does it mean when you have state actors with structurally different jobs getting paid out the same coffers. Then I think about a few years later, once public defenders become institutionalized, Eldridge Cleaver gives this interview. He gives this famous interview in the early 1970s, where he essentially says, here in the pen, you call PDs public defenders, but we call them penitentiary deliverers because they don't actually fight for people's cases. And so at this time of like the kind of constitutionalization of the right to counsel, which sounds like a good thing, racial minorities that are beginning to get incarcerated in larger numbers are suspicious of this idea that their attorney, who they see chatting with the prosecutor after the case in ways that are just them being colleagues, they're suspicious of that. But then I think that all leads to this kind of contemporary problem with plea bargaining. I think some of the nature of plea bargaining is just specific to the kind of evolution of boring legal rules that I won't get into details to, but I think there are a couple of things. I think, and this gets to your question about public defenders kind of imagining themselves as doing kind of racial justice work. I think part of it is tied, I think the ones that do are coming of a period, I would say definitely in the last 10 years, but even more recently, certainly with the publishing of Michelle Alexander's new Jim Crow, as well as other books on criminal justice, including your own, are starting to have like more of a recognition of the role of race in the criminal justice system, just because it's so obvious. And I would say up until maybe 7 or 8 years ago, people coming out of law school would say that mass incarceration is the defining human rights issue of their generation. Now I think people might say that / climate change. But I think there are attorneys who understand the work that they're doing as racial justice, in part because mass incarceration has just been a prominent theme of their lifetime. But I think some don't. Some don't for obvious reasons. Maybe they work in localities and jurisdictions that are, predominantly white, and so it makes sense that they might not think about it as a kind of exercise in racial justice. I think part of it is tied to, and I write about this in the other area of my work, the kinds of race neutral or race oblivious ways that classes in the criminal justice curriculum are taught. And so there are kind of 3 big classes in law schools that deal with criminal justice issues: criminal law, criminal procedure, and evidence. And in many of those classes, race don't come up. And so if race doesn't come up in the classroom, it's unlikely to come up often in many public defender offices, only until recently that they've begun to take up issues like implicit bias and thinking about the ways race influences the development, the provision of legal services. In the absence of that foregrounding in people's legal education, it's easy to believe, just thinking, I'm going to go help poor people, and at a bare minimum, or they might think, I'm helping poor people, and by helping poor people, some of whom are disproportionately people of color, I'm doing racial justice work, which is right, but may not be understanding the kind of independently operating features of race in the criminal justice system and the delivery of legal services. So that's how I might think about it. It looks like we have maybe about 10 minutes, so maybe we should open it to questions, and if not, we can continue to do our thing. I think Margot said she was going to take questions.
Yes, indeed. My video is hopefully going to appear soon. Can you hear me if you can't see me?
Yes, I hear you.
So I'm wondering, and I'm going to talk slowly so that hopefully people typing their questions, right, will not be shy and will begin to enter some of those questions in the chat. But I thank you both so much. And I also, like Elizabeth, Shaun, I can't wait to read the full book. And I really am thinking now about some of the references you made to the more general audience, Shaun. And I'm wondering, it looks like my video is going to finally work. Yes, indeed. I'm wondering, when you think about the more general audience, many of the people listening right now to this very conversation, I'm wondering if they also may be so struck that both of you, in terms of how you situate your work, it is indeed that intersection of law, history, sociology, and I would name many other zones. But I'm wondering, for this general audience, can you both think about what's at stake in terms of situating your work in this vibrant, capacious field of Black studies at this intersection of even those 3 fields we could name? We could add more, but law, history, sociology as a start. What's at stake? What do we see? What do you see, you both see, as you're situated at that intersection that perhaps can't be known if you're not doing that work that almost becomes transdisciplinary at that intersectional point? So I really wonder, in a meta sense, if you can share why it's important for you to situate your work in that manner.
Well, while Shaun writes, I'll just say a few things. I mean, and I kind of implied this earlier, but I think, we need history right now so badly. And we need history to explain racism and the ways in which racism has historically been embedded into our political and economic institutions. And so one of the things, and I also think that from a Black studies perspective, and I'll quote another one of my big mentors, who Margot mentioned earlier, who I've co-authored with, Manny Marable, and he said that history is a weapon in which we fight. And I think, you know, we're engaged in this racial justice struggle, and I think that history is something that that's going to be central in that struggle. And I think one of the things that's been really promising in recent years is that we're beginning to reckon with that history in new ways. But we need treatments like Shaun's. I think what's so brilliant about this book, Shaun, is that you really, by centering race and how we understand the kind of development of legal aid and public defending, you're using this as almost like a prism to link in a very exciting way slavery with mass incarceration. And I know that we talk about that a lot. We make these claims about mass incarceration being a new Jim Crow, but we actually need to understand how, like, the specific features about this in historical developments that make that trajectory possible. And I think that's, again, what's so powerful about your work is that it's very ambitious, it's sweeping. I don't envy you covering the hundreds of years of history of U.S. history, but I think that it's going to really pay off because we need treatments like this. People need to understand just how much racial inequality today is rooted in slavery. And I think we still have a lot to do to actually make those arguments. So you're helping us get there.
Thank you. Yeah, I would say, just kind of building on that, a couple of things. I got my PhD in African American Studies, and that was a deliberate choice. I would say a couple of things. One, I think, to echo an earlier comment I made, I don't think legal education treats race with the care and specificity that it should. And I'm of the opinion, not only as someone who got a PhD in African American Studies, and not only as an African American professor, but as someone who just studies law. I mean, at a bare minimum, we have 3 Reconstruction amendments that are specific about race. So that's 3 of less than 30. And that's not to include other constitutional amendments that are rife with ideas about race, whether we're talking about race and First Amendment and ideas about speech, whose religious free exercise of free religion we care about when we're thinking about this recent case that the Supreme Court decided involving COVID restrictions for the Catholic Church and Jewish organizations. Justice Sotomayor wrote a dissent where she talked about, what about what was going on with these Muslim bans? And so I think, same context in the Fourth Amendment context in terms of reasonable searches and seizures like that is not ostensibly about race, but there's been a public debate about stop and frisk policies for decades. And so I think part of what I imagine my training in African American Studies is doing is kind of centering the importance of race in our legal architecture and in our legal history. I think the other thing, and I think this is kind of tied to what Elizabeth was describing. I think history to me is so important, and the past couple of years have made clear with the kind of debate around the 1619 Project and just the kind of collective historical memory that we have. We don't even have a shared history in terms of how we understand the ebb and flow of racial injustice. And so so I see history as kind of obviously foregrounding the project, as well as legal doctrine and empirical social science. But what I see African American Studies is doing is providing me with the kind of flexibility to take on an ambitious project. It's not clear to me. I mean, I think big time historians take on these kinds of ambitious historical projects, but in the discipline of history, it's typically people try to confine it within 5 decades, confine their stories within 5 decades, I think for very much appropriate reasons. And I think coming to this from the perspective as an interdisciplinary legal scholar with training in African American studies, I think has provided me with a little kind of flexibility to ask different kinds of questions. I think law can sometimes, with the obvious exception of legal history, play fast and loose with history. And so I think there's flexibility there in terms of how I'm thinking about law. And I see kind of empirical social sciences providing some of the, along with archives, providing some of the evidentiary heft for the claims that I'm making. And so I see my training as pretty important to this project and hopefully helping kind of orient scholarly and public understandings of race and the law and criminal justice system.
Absolutely. And so it seems that, well, no, we don't have another question. So it means as we end, let me ask, I just want to check that I'm not missing any questions. No, I am missing a question. So I will not ask my next question. I will move to this question that's from the audience as our final question. And so the question is, during your presentation, you mentioned that the creation of mutual aid organizations were critical to the provision of legal aid to minority communities in the early 20th century. During the current pandemic, these kinds of support networks have been activated as a means to provide various types of aid to individuals who are largely disenfranchised from more formal types of sources of support, i.e. undocumented folks, particularly here in Philadelphia. Can you discuss how you see the current pandemic influencing the future development of legal aid here in the US?
Sure, thank you. So I would say, I mean, it's really hard to speculate, but to try to be brief, I see the kind of like, I wouldn't even call it kind of contemporary reemergence because they've always been there. And, you know, part of what I talk about in the book that I didn't describe in the main, in what Elizabeth read, is the importance of, you know, civil society more generally. And so during the civil rights movement, attorneys often organized through churches and through African American fraternities and sororities. Many of the cases that I described were litigated by lawyers who were in these civic organizations. And they remain important, as do various affinity groups. But I would say, I think what it means in this particular moment is two things that might sound contradictory, but that I think are actually go hand in hand. And the first is for people with racial justice commitments and commitments to kind of economic egalitarianism, we can't just rely on the state, because the state has proven itself to be inadequate, per Elizabeth's earlier comments in her discussion about her work about Cairo. Is like, we can't just rely on the states. That's inadequate. But I also think what it means is that we also have to keep pressing for the state to not abdicate its responsibilities to people in its borders. And I think, you know, as many of us are speculating what this means in the context of federal government, now that we have a new administration, some see kind of possibilities for not necessarily radical change, but maybe kind of moderate to liberal change. Some people are concerned about politics as usual. And so I think what the second prong of what I described means, a kind of insistence on the federal government meeting its responsibilities to people within its borders. But there's also a question about, you know, they say politics are local. There's also room for what we demand from our local and state governments. And I think some developments there are actually positive, you know, in the context of, you know, many, as I mentioned, many cities like Philadelphia, New York, San Francisco are starting to develop a right to housing court. Many states like California and New York are providing additional emergency relief in addition to the CARE Act, trying to think about ways to support undocumented communities that are hit hard by COVID and have consternation about getting testing. And so what I would say is that I think what these examples suggest is that, one, we shouldn't be completely reliant on the state. And I don't mean that in a self-help, pull yourself up by the bootstraps kind of way. But I think it also means that we should continue to kind of press for a kind of welfareist vision in the context of legal services, public benefits, and the criminal justice system.
And Elizabeth, would you add anything to that? Oh, you're muted. Sorry.
Yeah. Sorry about that. You're on these things all the time, and I still forget to unmute myself. But yeah, I think Shaun said it perfectly. I'm just in complete agreement.
Yes. Well, as we end, I want to end by applauding both of you. Thank you for your crucial work. Elizabeth Hinton, Shaun, Ossei-Owusu, thank you for this crucial work. And I want to thank everyone for joining us today. And please visit the Penn Center for Africana Studies website to get all of the details about our upcoming events. And everyone, have a good evening.
Thanks, Margot. Thanks, Elizabeth. Thanks, everyone.
It was my pleasure. Congratulations again, Shaun.
Thank you.